Like perhaps all of you, I'm interested in why everything feels so broken. Everything feels fraught with anxiety, tension. When I said at this place on this bema a couple of weeks ago that reading the newspaper has become a kind of act of courage, I was told later that it resonated with many others. I find myself needing escapes from what used to be simply ordinary living. My own escapes are pretty harmless. I read the sports pages more seriously than ever, even as my team is simply awful. I find myself reading more fiction than ever before. I yearn to get lost in stories. I long for the silence of silent prayer, as just now, simply to bring quiet to my soul. I listen for the beauty of the music of prayer, connecting me to what feels ancient, wise, soulful, solid, enduring. It gives me a feeling that noble ideals and ideas, ancient wisdom and values live on or can live on, no matter what the buffeting events of my short life. And this brings me a degree of comfort. And I find greater sympathy for those whose lives are less safe than mine, less secure, in their own need for unhealthy escapes, drink or drugs. If this moment of time makes me want to escape, I find greater empathy for those who live on the edge and need greater, more dangerous needs for escape. I also wish to understand the why. Why are these times what they are? So I'll turn back to not a friend, but a person whose books I've read over and over. So you can turn in your service sheet to page 6. You can read along with me a little bit. In lieu of a handout, we have kind of a built-in handout. So we'll read together from Neil Postman. Words I've read before, not for several years from this bema. I mean by narrative, Neil Postman writes, a story. But not any kind of story. I refer to big stories. Stories that are sufficiently profound and complex to offer explanations of the origins and future of a people. Stories that construct ideals, prescribe rules of conduct, specify sources of authority, and in doing all this, provide a sense of community and purpose. He goes on. What is important about narratives is that human beings cannot live without them. We are burdened with a kind of consciousness that insists on our having a purpose. Purposefulness requires a moral context, and moral context is what I mean by narrative. And then a few pages later in the book, Postman writes this, and I kind of jumped down. We come then to the question, exactly how can their narrative, he's referring to the narrative of the 18th century, help us to manage things in the century ahead, the 21st century? There are several ways I should like to suggest, but the first and most obvious is to reaffirm the necessity of a transcendent narrative, for without one, we can have no sense of purpose. Postman offers me insight when he says that we live inside of narratives, but we, on the other hand, live in an age of what I call broken narratives, or at least bitterly contested narratives, narratives that are scorned and condemned. I've said this before, but I intuitively feel this, and I will admit now it is very difficult for me to explain, extraordinarily difficult to explain what I mean. But the narrative is the cultural ground that we emotionally and psychologically walk on. It's what we take for granted. It is the assumptions upon which we build our lives and upon which our culture has built itself. And ours is cracked. So, for example, I believe that over 150 years ago, Abraham Lincoln captured the heart of our American narrative with the words, "Government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth." The entire speech, if you go back and read Lincoln's words at Gettysburg, feel biblical, as Lincoln used words like consecrate, hallow, and under God. Lincoln's words at Gettysburg offered the listener and us still today a sense of transcendence, that word that Postman uses to describe what a narrative needs to have. He offers us transcendence by using these words of the sacred. We get a hint in Lincoln's words that we are Americans because there is something more here. More? What do I mean? There's something more to being an American? So now it is what Thomas Nagel refers to when he writes, and I want to say and kind of give a pause to Louise, I had 3 or 4 other thinkers I wanted to refer to, but Louise was whispering in my head, please don't bring all those people out of your book closet. But it's what Thomas Nagel refers to when he writes, quote, "The religious temperament," and here I am suggesting that there is a religious temperament inside all of us, and the religious temperament inside all of us is too often dormant because we have made it so. So I will use the soulful temperament regards a merely human life as insufficient, as a partial blindness to or rejection of the terms of our existence. This is Thomas Nagel. It asks for something more encompassing without knowing what it might be. That's so important. We yearn for something not knowing what it might be. There's something more to being an American. As humans, we are unable to simply be. We are creatures that yearn for a transcendent framework in which to live, a narrative through which life has purpose and meaning. We want something that makes us feel like sometimes our lives can soar. Abraham Lincoln knew this. In writing these words, Lincoln is connecting of the people. Our elected people should be officials like us. Government should be of the people. They should somehow be relatable. By the people. We vote, we select. There is a sense of fair play and equality for the people, not for themselves or special interests, but government is for all of us. Lincoln is connecting these elements of democracy to something transcendent, something that elevates the human experience. Lincoln is suggesting that democracy makes us part of a grand human experiment, and he makes it sound so natural and so right. In an era of a broken narrative, it comes to sound naive, because a broken narrative invites cynicism. We live in an age of unabashed and rampant cynicism. It is the stock and trade of many public officials. Anyone who seeks to undermine the integrity of our system of government and our most cherished institutions is trading in cynicism. They are undermining Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg and his sacred legacy. There is, to be sure, plenty of reason for doubt. But the answer to doubt, the answer to the notion that a narrative is incomplete, that the soaring words don't encompass all of us, is not to destroy, but to build back better, both really and metaphorically, to rebuild trust, to expand trust, to rebuild faith, to expand faith, to rebuild hope, to expand hope, to be all-inclusive, more inclusive, for everybody, trust, faith, and hope that point towards a future. Nostalgia is always a trap. And Postman says, now to part 2 of Postman. You can go back to your handout. The construction of narratives is therefore a major business of our species. Certainly no group of humans has ever been found that did not have a story that defined for them how they ought to behave and why. That is the reason why there is nothing more disconcerting, to put it mildly, than to have one's story mocked, contradicted, refuted, held in contempt, or made to appear trivial. To do so is to rob a people of their reason for being. We are living through a time when our story is mocked, refuted, held in contempt, and paid to mere trivial by people who lay claim to wanting to be our leaders. So therefore, what we are living through is the angst, the chaos, and the travail of a broken narrative that is being broken before our eyes. When a people is robbed of an overarching narrative, the bottom falls out and we are left with fragments, competing stories of who we are. What we are experiencing in this country is so evidently true in Israel as well. As Jews, we are living with two broken narratives. The Zionist narrative has also been torn asunder. And this invites questions as to why. What causes narratives to no longer function? Here the answers are again so complicated, but I think that historical events come to expose and bring into focus real and searing. Got to do that again. I think that historical events come to expose and bring into focus real and searing societal problems that take real effort and openness to solve. A great transcendent narrative always is aspirational, not a picture of reality. So in the American story, the Civil War, slavery, emancipation that falls short, Jim Crow, World War I, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, the pushback against it, ultimately the Reagan Revolution and what it wrought have all combined to bring us where we are today. An American narrative of Lincoln and FDR for the 20th century torn asunder. Their aspirations fall short, cut off beneath their legs. And in Israel, the Six-Day War, occupation, the rise of a political religious Judaism are among the elements to undermine the Zionist narrative. It takes patience and maturity to expand and reach for the aspirations of a prevailing narrative. It is much easier to destroy. This is where we are now. But I want to end with a word of hope. I remain inspired by our biblical ancestors. So I'd like to close with a famous passage from the book of Kings that I was reminded of this morning as I responded to an email from someone who lives out of town and was asking me to comment about events in their own community. I like this passage a lot, and you'll know it all. Vayomer tzei v'amarata bahar, over v'ruach gadola v'chazak mefarek harim u'meshaber slaim, lo varuach Adonai v'achar haruach ra'ash lo barash Adonai. Come out, God called, and stand on the mountain. There is a great and mighty wind, splitting mountains and shattering rocks, but God was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. V'achar ra'ash eish, v'lo ba'eish Adonai, v'achar eish kol demamad dakah. After the earthquake, there was fire, but God wasn't in the fire. After the fire, a still, small voice. Elijah, you see, stood firm in the powerful wind. He stood firm in the power of the earthquake. He stood and withstood the fire. He was committed to the still small voice within. This is the Bible's metaphoric way of saying that Elijah lived through an earthquake, lived through a windstorm, lived through fire. These are all metaphors of what he was enduring in his time. He stood by his faith, what we might say by his principles. He stood by those principles like an immovable rock. This is the stuff of Jewish life. Jewish life has thrived in this country like at no other place or time in all of Jewish history. This is because of America's, yes, imperfect commitment to the Enlightenment principles of liberty and justice for all, government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and all men are created equal. Yes, an imperfect commitment to those principles. The philosophical ideas that generated these formulations go back to Genesis and the accompanying rabbinic commentaries. I believe that both here in Israel, we each have to stand for them as Elijah before us stood like a rock. Shabbat Shalom.